What if the document sitting in the British Museum right now, displayed behind glass in the Egyptian gallery, labelled the Book of the Dead, referenced in every anthropology textbook as evidence of a primitive death cult's attempt to bargain with the afterlife, is actually the most sophisticated consciousness navigation manual ever written? And the single name change made by a German scholar in 1842 is the reason the oldest and most precise map of human consciousness has been sitting in museum gift shops, mislabeled for 183 years. One word, replaced in 1842. And the entire conversation about what you are, what consciousness is, where it goes, how to navigate it, has been running through the wrong frame ever since. Before we go further, if this kind of buried layer is what you come here for, subscribe to the channel. Every week we go deeper than what the surface presents. The name Book of the Dead does not come from the ancient Egyptians. It was coined in 1842 by the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius, who published a collection of funerary papyri under the German title Das Totenbuch der alten Ägypter, the Death Book of the Ancient Egyptians. The title was descriptive of where the papyri were found, in tombs and burial chambers. It was not a translation of the Egyptian title. It was a label Lepsius invented because that is where the artifacts appeared. For 183 years, this label has been treated as the text's name. It is not. For 3,000 years before Lepsius published his catalogue, the Egyptians had called this text something entirely different, and what they called it changes every assumption Western culture has built around it. Pertemhru, that is the name. The Egyptian words translate directly, coming forth by day, or emerging into the light, or the Book of the Dawn. 3,000 years, same name. Then one scholar renamed it in 1842 and the world forgot what it was. In the temple complex at Karnak, approximately 1350 BC, a priest of Thoth is preparing a young initiate for what the tradition calls the Great Practice. The initiate has been in preparation for 3 years. He has learned the 72 names of Ra. He has memorized the formulas of the Duat's opening gates. Tonight, the priest places a rolled papyrus in the initiate's hands. It is not a funeral document. The initiate is not dying, and no one in the room is treating this as preparation for physical death. The papyrus contains navigation coordinates for a territory the initiate will enter in the altered state that the temple's preparation procedure is designed to produce. The priest says, "You have the map. Tonight you read it while you are still in the body." That is what the Pertemhru was designed for. If you have ever woken from a dream and felt, not thought, felt, that you had been somewhere more real than the room you woke up in, you have been in the territory the Pertemhru was written for. If you have ever been in the suspended state between sleeping and waking, when the boundary between your narrative identity and the open field of awareness briefly disappears and something in you is present without a location or a name, you have navigated the threshold the Egyptians called the entrance to the Duat. The text was written for you. The formulas are coordinates for the territory you have already entered. You just didn't have the map. The evidence that the Pertemhru was used by the living, not only placed in tombs for the dead, is embedded in the text itself and in the archaeological record. The papyrus of Ani, dating to approximately 1250 BC and now housed in the British Museum, contains explicit instructions for its use upon the earth. The Ani papyrus was commissioned by a royal scribe named Ani, a living official in the court of Rameses II, not a dying man commissioning posthumous arrangements. Multiple other New Kingdom papyri contain similar living use instructions in their introductory material. The text was understood by the culture that produced it as accessible to consciousness during life, specifically during the altered states induced by the temple preparation procedures. The tomb placement was secondary, a final use of a navigation tool that had been actively employed throughout the practitioner's lifetime. What is modern consciousness research discovering that keeps pointing back to the Pertem Hru, not symbolically, not as metaphor, as a structural description of the same territory that is now being mapped in laboratories at Johns Hopkins, Imperial College London, and the University of New Mexico for what researchers believe is the first time? The specific features that researchers document in psilocybin studies, DMT studies, and near-death experience research, the dissolution of the self-narrative, the encounter with geometric or luminous forms, the sense of moving through structured regions, the timeless state, the presence of communicative entities, the sense of returning from somewhere real, are the features that the Pertem Hru catalogues and names, chapter by chapter, across 189 spells. Not similar, structurally parallel. The map existed. Science is rediscovering the territory it describes. If hearing the real name of this text for the first time is already changing how you see everything the Egyptians left behind, write in the comments, "I came forth." For 180 years, the Egyptian religious tradition that produced the Pertem Hru was classified by Western Egyptology as a primitive death cult, a superstitious culture so afraid of mortality that it developed elaborate rituals to negotiate with gods for favorable posthumous judgment. The Johns Hopkins psilocybin studies, published starting in 2006 by Roland Griffiths and his team, describe in clinical language the specific experiential territory that the Pertem Hru maps in ritual language for the 3,000th time. The territory was not imaginary in 1350 BC. It is not imaginary in a controlled laboratory in Baltimore. The ancient tradition was not primitive. It was earlier. There is a difference between primitive and early, and Western Egyptology spent 180 years conflating the two when it came to the Pertem Hru. Roland Griffiths, Johns Hopkins, 2006. First controlled psilocybin study in 40 years, 30 volunteers. The results, 67% of participants rated the experience as among the 5 most meaningful of their lives. 33% rated it as the single most meaningful experience in their lifetimes. The specific features documented: dissolution of self-boundaries, union with something larger, timelessness, intense positive affect, and, this is the detail the clinical report does not draw attention to, the consistent sense of traversing structured internal regions, published in Psychopharmacology, not a spiritual publication, a peer-reviewed clinical journal. The Egyptians mapped what those subjects were traversing 3,500 years earlier. The modern scientific framing of what Griffith's subjects reported says, the psilocybin compound acted on serotonin receptors, producing an altered state in which the default mode network, the neural architecture responsible for self-referential processing, temporarily quieted, allowing the brain to operate in a different mode. The Egyptian framing of what the same subjects would have reported had they been in the temple rather than the laboratory says, the BR, the mobile aspect of soul, temporarily separated from the limiting frame of the personal narrative and entered the duat, the transitional state of consciousness that underlies the material world. Same experience, 2 complete explanatory systems. One of them is 3,500 years older, and one of them includes a 189-chapter navigation manual for the territory. The other one has been producing in laboratory settings for 20 years without a map. What does dissolution of the time sense look like in an ancient text? Spell 17, the longest and most philosophically complex chapter in the Pertem Hru, opens with the declaration, I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In the E.A. Wallace Budge translation of 1895, this is framed as the deceased claiming divine status in the afterlife. Read it instead as the description of a specific state of consciousness in which linear time stops being a sequence and becomes a field, a state in which past, present and future are simultaneously accessible because the time-binding function of the default mode network has quieted. The DMT subjects in Rick Strassman's 1990 studies at the University of New Mexico consistently described this state in modern language. Time stopped. It was all happening at once. Past and present were the same thing. The papyrus of Ani encodes the same state in spell 17 as a navigation coordinate. The destination is the same. The vocabulary is different. The territory is identical. Something in you already recognizes what this video is describing, not because you have studied Egyptian mythology. It is recognition of the territory. The territory is familiar because you have been in it. In sleep, you enter it nightly. In the gap between the end of one thought and the beginning of the next, the micro-moment before the self-narrative reconstitutes, you are in its threshold. In moments of extreme beauty, grief, fear, or love, that momentarily dissolved the story of who you are and left only awareness itself, without location or name, you were navigating the regions the Pert Emhru maps. The text is not introducing you to a foreign place. It is giving you the map of somewhere you already go. In 1990, Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico began the first legally approved psychedelic research in the United States since the 1970s, administering intravenous DMT, dimethyltryptamine, an endogenous compound produced by the human body, naturally released during deep sleep, to 60 volunteers in a controlled clinical setting. His subjects described with consistent specificity, navigating through structured spaces of increasing luminosity, encountering presences that communicated without words, moving through what they experienced as distinct regions with their own internal logic, and receiving information they felt was accurate and important. Strassman published his findings in DMT, the Spirit Molecule, in 2001. The territory his subjects described, structured, navigable, populated by presences, traversed through distinct regions, is the duat, not symbolically, structurally. If this is opening a different lens on what ancient Egypt actually knew, take a second to like this video. That signal helps this reach the people who need this map at the right moment. The academic dismissal says, coincidence. The geometric imagery, luminous beings, and structured regions Strassman's subjects described are products of the compound acting on universal visual cortex architecture, shared neurological machinery, not shared territorial knowledge. This dismissal would be more persuasive if the duat's 12 regions, as described in the Amduat, did not contain named presences and specific navigational instructions appearing with the same specificity in Strassman's clinical reports. Universal visual cortex architecture does not generate the same specific presences with the same consistent qualities across independent subjects in independent centuries. Consistent territory does. The word duat is the central conceptual hinge of the Pert Emhru, and how it is translated determines everything about how the text is understood. The standard Western Egyptological translation renders duat as underworld, which immediately imports the assumption that the duat is a place below the earth, associated with death, accessible only after physical death. None of these assumptions are present in the Egyptian concept. The Egyptian duat is the transitional zone between states of consciousness, the space the sun principle traverses between sunset and sunrise, the space between one state of awareness and another. It is not below the earth spatially. It is the interior of the transition. It is the liminal territory that consciousness crosses at the threshold between one mode and another, between sleep and waking, between ordinary identity and expanded awareness, between physical life and what follows physical life. The structure of the duat, as described in the Amduat, That which is in the Duat, the older companion text to the Pert Hru, divides the nocturnal journey into 12 hours, each hour corresponding to a specific region with specific features, specific presences, and specific navigational challenges. The solar principle, Ra, the animating intelligence of the cosmos, traverses these 12 regions every night between sunset and sunrise, encountering the forces of dissolution in the 5th and 6th hours, passing through the deepest point of the transition and re-emerging at dawn. The Pert Hru's name, coming forth by day, describes the conclusion of this 12-part journey, the emergence from the Duat into the light, not as a metaphor for what happens after death, as a description of the structure of the consciousness journey that both sleep and deeper altered states follow. Every night, every person. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, published in English in 1927, translated by W.Y. Evans Wentz, also misnamed. The Tibetan original is the Bardo Thodol. Bardo does not mean death state. Bardo means intermediate state, the gap between two things. The text is a guide for consciousness navigating transitions, any transition, including the one happening right now between thoughts, including sleep, including the transition that follows physical death. But that is one application, not the whole text. Same problem as the Pert Hru, different scholar, different century, same naming mistake. The Pert Hru and the Bardo Thodol were written on opposite ends of the ancient world, Egypt and Tibet, separated by approximately 3,000 kilometers and roughly 1,000 years before significant cultural contact between those two civilizations. And they describe the same journey, the dissolution of the self-narrative, the passage through intermediate states of increasing intensity, the decision point at which consciousness either recognizes the nature of awareness and moves toward liberation, or fails to recognize it and is pulled back toward rebirth. Carl Jung noticed this parallel in the 1930s and attributed it to universal archetypes. The structural parallel between the two texts is more specific than archetypes explain. Archetypes produce similar symbolic themes. Two civilizations independently documenting the same sequence of distinct experiential states with the same structural architecture suggests shared territory, not shared neurology. I've put something in the first pinned comment for those who are ready to go further than what a single video can cover. Check it there when you're ready. Spell 125 is the most famous chapter in the Pert Hru. Every university Egyptology course covers it. Western scholarship names it the negative confession, the list of 42 declarations the deceased makes before the 42 assessors, claiming not to have committed 42 specific violations, the standard academic framing, a list of moral requirements for posthumous judgment structurally similar to other ancient afterlife evaluation systems. Similar to the Zoroastrian Chinvat Bridge, similar to the Christian Last Judgment, a death bargaining ritual from a culture afraid of posthumous punishment. The operational reading, the reading consistent with the text's actual Egyptian conceptual vocabulary, is structurally different from all of this. What Spell 125 describes is not moral evaluation, it is calibration confirmation. The 42 assessors are not judges. They are alignment checks. Ma'at, the governing principle of the cosmos, is not an external authority who decides your fate. Ma'at is the fundamental structural logic of the universe. The heart being weighed against Ma'at's feather is not a moral evaluation. It is a calibration measurement. The question is not, did you deserve paradise? The question is, does your consciousness carry enough coherence to navigate what comes next without fragmentation? That is a technical question, not a theological one. The answer determines what happens in the deepest regions of the Duat, not as punishment or reward, as the physics of navigation. The distinction between a religion and a technology is important here, and requires stating precisely. A religion evaluates behavior against a moral code that an authority has set and assigns outcomes based on compliance. A technology describes what internal conditions are necessary for a specific process to work correctly. Spell 125 is the second kind. The 42 declarations are not moral claims made to secure divine favor. They are confirmations of internal calibration, the specific orientation of consciousness that allows navigation of the duat's deepest regions without losing coherence. When Annie declares before the 42 assessors, "I have not distorted the scales, and I have not made crooked that which was straight," these are not moral boasts. They are alignment confirmations. The duat's deepest navigation requires a consciousness that is genuinely aligned with Mayat's principle, not performing alignment, actually having it. Pim van Lommel is a Dutch cardiologist who spent 10 years, from 1988 to 1998, conducting a prospective study at Rhine State Hospital in the Netherlands of patients who had survived cardiac arrest. 344 patients. All had experienced clinical death, flatline EEG, no detectable brain activity. 62 of them, when they regained consciousness, reported what they described as coherent, structured experiences that occurred during the period of no detectable brain function. These experiences shared consistent structural features: the sense of moving out of the body, the transition through a structured space, the encounter with presences, the life review, the boundary point, and the return. Van Lommel published his findings in The Lancet in 2001. The territory his subjects reported navigating during verified clinical death corresponds, region by region, to the structure the Pert-Emhru maps. The significance of Van Lommel's Lancet study for the Pert-Emhru question is not simply that near-death experiences exist, that had been documented since Raymond Moody's Life After Life in 1975. The significance is what the study's methodology proved. These experiences occurred during periods of verified no-brain activity. The brain was not generating the experience. When the default mode network is completely offline, when the EEG is flat, when the neural substrate of the self-narrative is not functioning, something continued to navigate, continued to perceive, continued to encounter structured territory. The Egyptians had a name for that navigating something: the Ba. The mobile aspect of consciousness the Pert-Emhru addresses directly in all 189 chapters. Not the brain, not the body, the Ba. It navigated. It encountered specific presences and specific regions. It reported what it had seen. Van Lommel documented this 3,500 years after the Egyptians wrote the map for it. When something in you shifts while watching this, not intellectually, but in the body, in the chest, in the way the room around you momentarily feels different, that is the Ba's response to recognition of its own territory. The Ba knows the duat. It navigates it every night during sleep. It navigates its thresholds every time the self-narrative briefly dissolves in meditation, in shock, in profound beauty. It knows the map exists because it has been operating without one in the same territory for your entire life. What shifts when the Ba encounters a description of the duat is not belief. It is orientation. A navigator who has been working from dead reckoning suddenly receiving a chart. Jan Assmann, professor of Egyptology at Heidelberg. His book, Death and Salvation in Ancient Egypt, published in German in 2001. Translated into English in 2005. 400 pages. Philological evidence, anthropological analysis, textual comparison. His core argument: Egyptian mortuary literature was never primarily about physical death. It was about the transformation of consciousness, alignment with Ma'at as a practice of living. The Pert-Emhru was not a death manual. It was a consciousness manual that was also used at death. The distinction matters enormously when you are deciding how to read the text in your own life. What the popular account says about the Pert-Emhru, an elaborate death ritual from a culture obsessed with the afterlife, reflecting primitive religious beliefs about posthumous judgment, useful primarily as archaeological evidence of ancient Egyptian religious practice. What Jan Assmann's 400 pages of scholarship show, a 3,000-year tradition of systematic consciousness practice. Connective justice, Assmann calls it, the alignment of individual consciousness with cosmic principle, that used the Pert Emru as its primary operative text during practitioners' lifetimes and placed it in tombs as a final act of the same practice rather than as its primary application. The archaeology preserved the last use location. The scholars named the text after the last use location, and the entire understanding of what the text is for was inverted by the naming mistake. What changes if we stop calling it the Book of the Dead and use the actual Egyptian title, Pert Emru, the Manual of Coming Forth by Day? Everything about how the text is approached changes. The Book of the Dead is a document for dead people. You have no relationship to it in life. You pick it up in the gift shop, look at the illuminated panels, put it back. Pert Emru, the Manual of Coming Forth by Day, is a document for consciousness navigating transitions. You are doing that right now, between each breath. The text is describing territory you are in constant relationship with. The difference is not semantic. It is the difference between a museum artifact in a case and a working navigation instrument in your hands. The neuroscientific work that most precisely describes what the Pert Emru calls the kat, the physical identity layer, the first garment that the BA encounters at the threshold of deep altered states, comes from Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College London. His 2014 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences mapped for the first time the specific brain mechanism by which the self-sense temporarily dissolves in psilocybin states. The default mode network, the neural architecture of I, reduces its activity, and when the I quiets, something else remains, present, coherent, navigating. The neurological description confirms what the Pert Emru states directly. The BR is not the personal identity. It is what remains when the personal identity is temporarily set aside. Modern neuroscience has described the mechanism of that setting aside. It has not yet given a name to what is still there when it happens. The Hall of the Two Truths, in spell 125 of the Pert Emru, is depicted in the Papyrus of Ani with one of the most carefully composed illuminated panels in the text. Osiris seated on his throne, 42 assessors arranged in rows, the deceased Ani standing with his hands raised, Anubis guiding the scales, Thoth with his writing palette, recording the result, and Amit, the composite beast, crouching beside the balance. Every element of this scene is operational, not decorative. Anubis guides because he is the principle of navigating transitions. Thoth records because cosmic registration is required for the navigation to be acknowledged by the system. Amit is not punishment, but dissolution, the fate of a consciousness that cannot hold enough coherence to proceed. The scene is a map displayed as an image, and the map is accurate. Amit devours the heavy heart. This is not punishment, this is reset. Consciousness that cannot hold Ma'at's coherence through the weighing does not go to a place of suffering. It returns to the beginning, re-enters the cycle, attempts the journey again. The Duat is not a court of judgment. It is a navigation system with a coherence requirement. If the navigation fails, if the heart fails the weighing, the process begins again, not as a punishment for wrongdoing, as the natural consequence of attempting to move through a transition for which the consciousness is not yet ready. The Pert Emru is a manual for becoming ready. The structural parallel between the Pert Emru's weighing of the heart and the Tibetan Bardo Thodol's instruction to recognize the clear light is not thematic. It is technical. Both texts describe the same decision point, a moment of maximum clarity that appears during the deepest phase of the transition, in which consciousness either recognizes its own nature and moves toward liberation, or fails to recognize it and is drawn back toward rebirth. The Egyptian version calls this the weighing of the heart against Ma'at's feather. The Tibetan version calls it the encounter with the Dharmakaya light. The consequence of non-recognition in both texts is identical: re-entry into the cycle of embodied experience, beginning again, not as punishment, as continuation of the learning process that the cycle of embodied existence supports. The scholarly lineage that has understood the Pertem Hru as a consciousness navigation text rather than a death ritual includes more than Assmann. Jeremy Nadler's Temple of the Cosmos, 1996, documents the evidence for ritual-altered state practices in Old Kingdom Egypt. R.O. Faulkner's definitive 1972 scholarly translation, titled The Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Book of Going Forth by Day, used the correct title even while the gift shops continued using the wrong one. The academic mainstream has been slow to engage with this literature. The evidence it documents does not disappear because the mainstream declines to engage. The duat is not a place you go after death. It is a territory your consciousness enters every night and every time your self-narrative momentarily releases. You have been there. In the moment between waking and sleeping, when your body felt heavy and your thoughts began dissolving into imagery. In the moment of a close call when time slowed and you were suddenly aware with perfect clarity of the space around each object. In grief so complete that the person you thought you were temporarily ceased to function, and what remained was simply presence, without history or expectation. Those were not unusual experiences. Those were approaches to the duat's threshold. The Pertem Hru was written for exactly those moments, all 189 chapters of it, and you have been approaching them your entire life without a map. The materialist objection to everything this video presents says, all of these experiences, the Johns Hopkins psilocybin states, the Strassman DMT states, the Van Lommel NDE states, are produced by brain chemistry. The brain generates subjective experiences, including experiences that feel more real than ordinary reality, that feel like navigation of structured territories, that feel like encounters with genuine presences. The experience is real as an experience. The territory it appears to describe is not. Van Lommel's Lancet study is the specific piece of evidence this objection cannot absorb without restructuring. The NDEs in Van Lommel's study did not occur during altered brain chemistry. They occurred during the complete absence of detectable brain function verified by continuous EEG monitoring in a clinical setting. If the brain generates the experience, what generates the experience when the brain has stopped generating anything? The BA, the Egyptian concept, has no exact Western equivalent, not soul in the Christian sense, not consciousness in the neuroscientific sense, not the output of neural computation. The BA is what remains when personal identity is not operating, the navigating presence, the aspect of you that is present and oriented, even when the self-narrative has gone quiet. Every night in deep sleep, the BA navigates. Every time the default mode network quiets, the BA is what is still there. Van Lommel's subjects reported from there. Strassman's subjects reported from there. Griffith's Hopkins subjects reported from there. The Pertem Hru was written for there. All three sets of researchers documented the same navigating presence. From different centuries, different laboratories, the Egyptians called it the BA first. If the BA navigates the duat every night during deep sleep, which the Pertem Hru states directly, and which the structural parallel between deep sleep phenomenology and the text's described territories partially corroborates, what is the practical implication for your life right now? The implication is that you are navigating a complex territory every night without a map, not without the capacity. The BR navigates regardless of whether you are aware of it, without the orientation, without knowledge of the regions you are moving through, the presences you encounter, the specific navigational instructions for proceeding toward the re-emergence that the text calls coming forth by day. The map exists. The territory is real. Every night you navigate it. The question is whether you navigate with orientation or without it. Spell 1 of the Pert Emhru is the first thing placed in order. In Budge's 1895 translation it reads, "Here begin the spells of coming forth by day and of glorifying and deifying in the realm of the dead." The frame imposed by the translation, a funerary preamble setting up the posthumous document's purpose. The operational content. Spell 1 establishes the BA's orientation, its direction of travel, its point of origin, the embodied state, and its destination, the unified field of Ra, the solar principle. In modern navigational language, it is the GPS initialization. It tells the navigator where it is going, and which principle of orientation applies. Before you enter the Duat, spell 1 sets your heading. The text was always a navigation instrument. The first page was always the initialization screen. Howard Carter opens the entrance to Tutankhamun's burial chamber on November 4, 1922. Inside, his framework, trained by 1920s Egyptology, identifies a funerary assemblage. What he actually finds, from the perspective of the tradition that assembled it, is a navigational kit. The Pert Emhru, the Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Book of Caverns. Multiple overlapping navigational texts, each describing the same 12-region journey from a different angle, cross-referencing each other, covering the approaches and alternatives. Not one map, but 4 maps of the same territory, assembled for the same navigator, not because Tutankhamun's priests were superstitious about death, because the territory is complex enough to warrant multiple maps, and the tradition maintained the resources to provide them. The Amduat, that which is in the Duat, is older than the Pert Emhru. Its full text appears in New Kingdom royal tombs beginning approximately 1500 BC. Its conceptual structure is older still. Elements of the Amduat's 12-region architecture appear in the pyramid texts, which date to approximately 2400–2300 BC and are the oldest surviving religious corpus in the world. The oldest surviving religious texts describe the same consciousness navigation territory that psilocybin research is currently mapping from clinical reports. The map was drawn first. The theological elaboration, the ritual system, the mythological narrative, these developed around the map. The consciousness territory came before the religion that grew to describe it. The pyramid texts are not proto-religious mythology. They are the earliest surviving navigation manual for a territory modern science is currently rediscovering from inside. What you are holding in your awareness right now, this sentence, the quality of light in the room, the weight of your body, the ambient sounds, the background of thoughts, is the surface layer of a multi-layer awareness system that the Pert Emhru spent 3,000 years mapping in detail. The text was not describing what happens after death. It was describing the deeper layers of what you are right now, accessible below the narrative identity that calls itself by your name. You are more than that narrative. The Ba is more than that narrative. The territory of the Duat is within you, not after you. The Pert Emhru maps what you already are, not what you will become after death. The orientation the text provides is not posthumous. It is for now, for tonight, for the moment between this breath and the next. The objection from mainstream religious tradition says these are pagan texts with no connection to the spiritual truths preserved in Scripture. The counter is not theological, it is textual. Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. The Hebrew original, Gate Selmaveth, means the valley of deep darkness, the valley of shadow. The navigational instruction is structurally identical to the Pert Emhru's core teaching. Move through the deepest darkness without fear, because the fundamental animating principle accompanies you. The Egyptian tradition calls that accompanying principle Ra. The Hebrew tradition calls it God. The navigation instruction, traverse the darkness with the awareness that the source accompanies, is the same in both texts. The consciousness technology is universal. Only the cultural vocabulary is different. The suppression of the Pert Emhru's actual nature does not require a conspiracy to explain. It requires only institutional inertia. Carl Richard Lepsius made a scholarly decision in 1842 that was consistent with the intellectual framework of his time. Victorian Egyptology, which classified ancient cultures hierarchically and positioned Egyptian religion as developmentally primitive relative to Western modernity. That decision was wrong, but it was made from within a limited framework rather than from malice. The problem is, what happened next? The label was adopted, taught, printed, displayed, and reproduced in textbooks, museum catalogues, documentary titles, and online encyclopedias. Every reproduction of the wrong name maintained the wrong frame. Not because anyone was choosing to mislead, because the institutional structure preserves what has been established, and what had been established was wrong. The modern convergence of independent disciplines arriving at the Pert Emhru's territory has been building for decades. 1975, Raymond Moody publishes Life After Life, documenting the NDE pattern for the first time in clinical language. 1990, Strassman begins DMT research. 2001, Van Lommel's Lancet study. 2006, Griffiths publishes the Hopkins psilocybin data. 2014, Carhart-Harris publishes the default mode network research under psilocybin. Each study discovers territory the Pert Emhru mapped with specific chapter coordinates 3,500 years earlier. The convergence has been happening, one laboratory study at a time, for 50 years. The map was always there. The researchers keep finding it without knowing it was drawn. What would change in consciousness research if the starting point were the acknowledgement that an ancient civilization had already mapped this territory? If the Johns Hopkins team approached the psilocybin data as confirmatory rather than exploratory, confirming coordinates the Pert Emhru already charted, the interpretive framework would shift entirely. Instead of subjects report encounters with presences and traversal of structured regions, the finding would be subjects confirm the characteristics of the Duat's third region as described in Spell X. The map already exists. Science is doing the work of confirming it from the inside out, without realizing it is confirming rather than discovering. The reason you have not clicked away, right now, past the point where most people in this landscape would have, is not discipline. It is the bar's recognition of its own territory. The bar is not a philosophical abstraction. It is the aspect of you that was present during every moment of your life when the self-narrative temporarily stopped running. It was present in the deep sleeps you remember as nothing but know you returned from changed. It was present in the moments of extreme clarity or extreme grief, when the story of who you are briefly dissolved and something simpler and more direct took its place. The bar recognizes the map because the bar has been navigating the territory the map describes. It keeps you watching because the map is its map, and this is the first time you are encountering it with its correct name. The British Museum's current website description of the Papyrus of Ani, the most complete surviving example of the Pert Emhru, dating to approximately 1250 BC, calls it the most famous and most elaborate example of the Egyptian illustrated funerary text known as the Book of the Dead. Every word in that description embeds the Lepsius frame. Funerary text, Book of the Dead. The Papyrus of Ani is the most complete surviving example of a 3,500-year-old consciousness navigation manual, illustrated with 80 separate illuminated scenes, each depicting a specific encounter in a specific region of the Duat, produced for a living royal scribe who was almost certainly an active practitioner of the navigation tradition during his lifetime. The world's most complete version of the oldest consciousness map in recorded history is in London, behind glass, still called the wrong name. The 80 illuminated scenes in the Papyrus of Ani are not decorations. The jackal-headed Anubis who appears in the Hall of the Two Truths is not chosen for aesthetic reasons. Anubis is the principle of navigating the threshold between states, and he appears because he is the navigational principle. The baboon-headed Thoth does not appear because the Egyptians liked baboons. Thoth is the registrar of consciousness, the principle by which the universe records its own state. He appears because his presence is functionally accurate. The images are visualization tools. Exactly as a Buddhist practitioner uses a thangka, exactly as a trained meditator uses a yantra. Visual technology for inducing the state the text describes by providing something specific for the Bia's awareness to orient toward during entry into the Duat. The Papyrus of Ani is illustrated because the illustrations are part of the technology, not decoration for a document. The Pert-em-Hru contains explicit instructions for its use during the practitioner's lifetime in the text itself, which means the living use interpretation is not a modern scholar's reinterpretation. The Egyptians documented it directly. The introductory rubric of spell 130 states that the spell is to be recited upon earth, and that it is effective in life, not only after death. The introductory rubric of spell 148 states that its content is of benefit to the person in this world. These instructions appear in the published translations, including Budge's 1895 edition. The scholarly frame that insisted the Pert-em-Hru was primarily a funerary text had to actively disregard these explicit living use instructions to maintain that frame. The instructions were visible in the text the entire time, not hidden, overlooked, because the framing had already been set before the full text was read. The cosmological framework in which the Pert-em-Hru operates comes from the Hermopolitan tradition, centered at the city of Kmun, the cult center of Thoth. In the Hermopolitan creation cosmogony, the universe came into existence through the primordial creative word, the naming by which the cosmos became coherent. Consciousness is not a product of matter in this framework. It is the fundamental substrate from which matter emerges. The Duat is not a place that exists within the material world. It is the level of reality that underlies the material world, the consciousness substrate from which both matter and awareness arise. The Pert-em-Hru does not describe a journey through a supernatural space. It describes navigation of the level of reality that underlies ordinary waking experience, accessible whenever the material identity layer is temporarily set aside. The hard problem of consciousness is still trying to formulate this. The Hermopolitan tradition built a navigation manual for it 3,500 years ago. The map was always available. It has been in print in English since 1895. The most commonly available version, Budge's translation, the one with the wrong name and the flawed frame, is available free online. The Faulkner Scholarly Edition with the correct title is in print. The Papyrus of Ani is in the British Museum, its 80 illuminated panels documented in high-resolution photography, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Nothing about the Pert-em-Hru has been hidden for 183 years. What was changed was the label, from Pert-em-Hru to Book of the Dead, and the label changed the frame, and the frame changed what people brought to the text when they encountered it. The map was always there. The wrong name made it look like a museum artifact rather than a working instrument. The final objection this video needs to address directly. Even if everything presented here is accurate, even if the Pert Emhru is a consciousness navigation manual and not a funerary text, what can you practically do with that information? You are not an Egyptian priest. You do not have access to the initiation procedures, the preparation sequences, the specific altered state induction methods the temple tradition used. You cannot navigate the Duat the way Ani did with 3 years of preparation in the Temple of Thoth at Karnak. The objection is partially correct. The full navigational system the Pert Emhru supports required a living tradition to activate. But the objection misses something the text itself explicitly states, and that statement is in the published translations that have been available for 50 years. The text is available. The Faulkner translation, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Book of Going Forth by Day. In print, not rare, not restricted. The individual spells, workable as meditation anchors, as visualization frameworks, as orientation tools for the states you already enter. Spell 17 for the dissolution of linear time. Spell 125 for the calibration of alignment. Spell 64 for the single master key. You do not need the full temple preparation to begin using the text's orientation. You need to know what territory you are entering when you enter it. You need the map. The map is in print. The BI already navigates. The text gives the navigation orientation it has been missing. Tonight, in the space between waking and sleep, the hypnagogic threshold, the liminal zone that EEG research identifies as theta wave dominant, the same frequency range the King's Chamber at Giza produces naturally in its acoustic resonance pattern. You will enter the Duat, not metaphorically. The hypnagogic state is the threshold of the first region of the Duat, as described in Spell 1 of the Pert Emhru. This will happen whether you remember it or not, whether you have read the text or not. What changes with the map is orientation. Instead of entering a territory without coordinates, you enter with Spell 17's declaration, I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Not as a claim, as an orientation setting. Spell 1's initialization, I know where I am, I know where I'm going. The animating principle accompanies me. That is the difference between navigation and drift. What becomes possible when the oldest consciousness navigation manual in recorded history is read as what it actually is? What the tradition describes as the full fruit of the Pert Emhru's practice, a consciousness that navigates the Duat's transitions, the nightly sleep transition, the deep meditation transition, the great transition at physical death, with enough coherence and orientation that it comes forth on the other side of each transition with its orientation intact. The Egyptian term for this state is Sahu, the spiritualized body, the consciousness that has successfully navigated enough transitions that its alignment with Ma'at is no longer an effort but a permanent condition. The Pert Emhru is a manual for developing Sahu. The 189 chapters are 189 practices, each corresponding to a specific region of the transition, each building the coherence that region requires. The King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid at Giza has an acoustic property that has been measured and documented by researchers, including acoustic archaeologist John Reed. At 111 Hz, the chamber produces measurable resonance patterns. This specific frequency corresponds precisely to the theta brainwave range in modern EEG research. Theta is the frequency associated with hypnagogic states, deep meditation, NDE-adjacent consciousness, and the altered states documented in both the Hopkins psilocybin studies and the Strassman DMT research. The Egyptians built a chamber that naturally produces the frequency that puts human consciousness into the state the Pert Emhru maps. They did not build a tomb. They built the machine that produces the state the map is for. The map and the machine were designed together. The machine is still standing. The map is still in print. 3 days. Osiris was dismembered, placed in a coffin and restored. 3 days in the deepest region of the Duat before the re-emergence. Jonah was in the belly of the great fish, the oldest symbol for the deepest consciousness transition, 3 days before coming forth. Jesus in the tomb, 3 days before the resurrection. The same number. Across 3 independent traditions separated by centuries. The 3 days is not biographical data. It is a report on the experiential duration of the deepest navigational passage. The tradition's navigational knowledge recorded that the Duat's 12th region, the deepest threshold before the re-emergence, corresponds to 3 days of consciousness time. The number is a coordinate, not a miracle claim, a navigational measurement that 3 independent traditions preserved because they had all made the measurement independently. The part of you that kept watching this has already asked the question that the Pert Emhru was written to answer, not what happens after death, though that question is in the text. The question beneath that question, what am I actually? Not the name, not the history, not the story, but the awareness that has been present for every moment of your life. The awareness that was there before the first memory and will be there after the last thought. The Pert Emhru names that awareness the Ba. It describes its origin, its nature, its relationship to the body, its navigational capacity, and its destination after the great transition, not as theology. As a map, the Ba is reading this sentence right now. That is why you stayed. The suppression of consciousness knowledge that runs counter to materialist frameworks does not require coordination to occur. It requires only the consistent application of institutional filters. Peer review evaluating novelty against existing paradigms will underweight evidence that challenges foundational assumptions. Funding structures that prioritize practical application will underfund consciousness research. Educational curricula will present the Pert Emhru as a cultural artifact rather than a technical document. No one chooses these outcomes. The institutional logic produces them automatically. The result, the most significant documentation of consciousness navigation in recorded history, sits in a museum gift shop, in a translation with the wrong name, systematically under-contextualized, not by conspiracy, but by a category error reproducing itself since 1842. The 189 chapters of the Pert Emhru, in its most complete surviving form, the Papyrus of Ani British Museum collection, are organized not chronologically, not narratively, but territorially. Each chapter addresses a specific region of the Duat, a specific type of navigational challenge, or a specific aspect of the consciousness transformation. The chapters addressing the dissolution of personal identity, spells 23 through 29, concern the release of the consciousness from attachment to the physical form. The chapters addressing the 12 hours of the nocturnal journey correspond to the Amduat's 12-region structure. Spell 64, the master formula, condenses the entire navigational system into a single text that the tradition states can serve in place of all 189. The architecture is the architecture of a technical manual organized by use case, not by narrative sequence, because it was a technical manual. An initiate in the king's chamber at Giza, approximately 1400 BC, prepared for 3 days in the chamber. No light. The granite resonates at 111 Hz from the sound moving through the pyramid's shafts, a frequency that puts human consciousness into theta. The initiate's BA navigates the Duat regions, with the spells already memorized, using the illuminations of the Pert Emhru as visualization anchors, moving through 12 regions of increasing depth. By the end of the 3rd day, the initiate emerges. The tradition records this emergence as coming forth by day, Pert Emhru. The initiate has navigated the deepest navigational passage and returned with their orientation intact. This is not mythology. The chamber is still there. The resonance can still be measured. The text is still in print. The scholarly shift in understanding the Pert Emru moved decisively with R.O. Faulkner's 1972 critical translation. Faulkner spent 40 years with the Egyptian language. He was the author of the definitive, concise Dictionary of Middle Egyptian, and approached the Pert Emru with philological precision that Budge's 1895 work fundamentally lacked. His title for the text, The Book of Going Forth by Day, uses the correct translation of Pert Emru. His footnotes document the places where Budge's Victorian theological assumptions produced systematic mistranslations. The scholarly community that works with the Egyptian language directly has understood the correct title and the correct frame since at least 1972. The popular understanding has not caught up. The gap between what specialists know and what the general public has been taught has been maintained, without anyone choosing to maintain it, for 50 years since Faulkner corrected the record. What you do with this map tonight is specific. In the hypnagogic state, the threshold between waking and sleep, hold spell 17's first declaration, I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Not as a belief claim, not as something you are trying to convince yourself of, as an orientation setting, a compass heading for the navigation that your bar is about to undertake, whether you hold it or not. The Pert Emru does not require the Temple of Thoth at Karnak to produce its first effect. It requires a consciousness that knows it is navigating and knows in which direction it is traveling. Spell 17 sets the direction. Tonight, in the threshold, you know the direction. That is already more than most people who have ever entered that threshold have had with them. Spell 64 is described in the Pert Emru's introductory rubric as the single formula that allows navigation of all 189 regions, the complete duat, without requiring the other 188 spells individually. The tradition considers it the most important of all the chapters. What it contains is a declaration of identity so complete that it encompasses every region, every challenge, and every navigational state that the full text addresses separately. It does not describe the territory. It establishes the navigator's fundamental orientation so precisely that the territory cannot disorient it. This is the principle the entire 189-chapter map is built to communicate. Not a formula for each situation, but a fundamental orientation so deeply established that no situation can displace it. The Pert Emru is a 189-chapter manual for developing the consciousness that spell 64 describes in a single declaration. Everything in the text points toward that one arrival. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, I came forth by day. There's another step on your screen right now, your next path on this map. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.